Guyong. I co-direct the Center for Integral Ecology at Benedictine that's sponsoring tonight's symposium. It's very exciting to have you here. So the Center for Integral Ecology, if you're not familiar with it, the word integral indicates we're integrating faith and reason, care for the natural world with respect for the most vulnerable humans amongst us. And the two figures we're going to be discussing tonight, Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, and St. John Henry Newman, are two people who integrated that in their own work throughout their lifetime. So the embeddedness of man in creation and our duty to care for creation. And one of the events that kind of got this particular evening going is there's a book that Father Emery de Gaal invited here to speak, our third speaker, co-edited. It's St. John Henry Newman and Joseph Ratzinger, A Theological Encounter. So in this book, which we're going to have a free giveaway of, sitting right over there, later this evening, it covers a lot of areas. In fact, these two men are likely future doctors of the church, and so they've written pretty much on every topic you can think of. But that particular book that we're celebrating as our impetus for tonight, they write on doctrinal development, relationship of faith and reason, biblical inspiration. Dr. Muller has a specialization on that in particular with Newman. Mystery, conscience. Father de Gaal has definitely written on that. Divinization, attentiveness to the signs of the times, interculturality, divine revelation, the church's mystical body, ecclesial authority, and the relationship of faith and natural science, which is featured tonight. Well, I wanted to say a few words for those of us who did not grow up with Ratzinger or Newman as household names. These are really the paragon of dynamic orthodoxy in my formation and for a lot of us who teach here. An intelligent faith lived with integrity, in charity, for the search of truth. So Ratzinger, I was just talking to Father de Gaal at dinner, who knows Ratzinger, he was his archbishop. His career is amazing, and I just wanted to say a couple of things. So he was the real number one go-to defender of orthodoxy for such a long time in the church, as a professor, as a bishop, as cardinal head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and then as pope. So I was trying to count this up. It's not that hard of math, but from 1981, when he was made cardinal prefect of the Congregation, the CDF, by John Paul II, until 2005 when he died, so 81 to 05, what's that, 24 years, he was either basically number one or two man in the church as regards doctrine. So that's pretty remarkable. And no one has spoken on such an array of topics as Ratzinger. I love being a Ratzinger scholar because that means you get to write on anything. Same thing when you're an Aquinas scholar, and bringing those together is awful fun, but no one has really done so, has just engaged this full breadth of reason, as he calls it, in such breadth, clarity, and depth as Ratzinger. Cardinal Schönborn came here one of my early years here at Benedict, I think it was 09 or 2010, and Schönborn made a comment that because of his role spending all of these decades at the helm of the church, there's really no one better than Ratzinger to look to in an age of confusion to know what exactly the church teaching on any given subject is. So hard to beat him, except maybe Newman does, I don't know. Who can sing his praises enough? The church owes much of her rich understanding of doctrinal development to Newman. His essay on the development of Christian doctrine was the first theology paper I ever wrote. Maybe that was a mistake, but it was a great one. I'm indebted to my wonderful professor, Ken Howell, who got me onto that. And some of us, myself being one of them, we studied and lived at a Newman Center. For those of you who, obviously you went to Benedictine, but if you have people you know at a secular place, he's the guy that they named Newman Centers after. Our very vision at Benedictine College is largely grounded in basically his idea of the university, another book of his. And so really, Newman is hard to beat, and your very own Dr. Muller over there has even contributed to a document submitted to Pope Francis in which he's being petitioned as a doctor of the church as we speak. So really hard to beat Cardinal Newman. And so I'm excited for our conversation tonight. And with all that in mind, I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker. And I'm going to just give a few words about Dr. Muller, who, contrary to my mistake in putting the material together, he's associate professor. Guys, that means he has tenure. So you can't mess with Dr. Muller. And he's director of our Symposium for Transforming Culture at Benedictine. So Dr. Muller teaches a variety of courses: Christian moral life, modern church history, fundamental theology, ecclesiology. He's taught courses in the evangelization and catechesis program. His research interest is in the thought and legacy of Newman. He has served on the board of directors for the St. John Henry Newman Association of America and the editorial board for the Newman Studies Journal. He completed his PhD in historical theology from St. Louis University in 2017. He has a master's in Catholic Studies from the University of St. Thomas, Minnesota. And after graduating from here at BC in 2006, he served for 3 years as a missionary with focus at the University of Illinois, where I was working at the time and met the guy. We both ended up here together. Most recently, Dr. Muller has been engaged in a project especially fitting for tonight's event, as he has worked on this formal document submitted to the Pope. So without further ado, let's hear about Newman from Dr. Muller.
All right, thank you. Now, I was actually showing the document that he's talking about to my in-laws last night at my house, and there's a letter in there from a priest from the London Oratory reminding me that that document is confidential Vatican document and not to share it with anybody. So, okay, don't tell anybody, all right? Keep it in this room. Don't go on social media, right, and say, Dr. Muller did this, okay? It's not a deal yet. So, we're live streaming. Edit that. But let's see. There it goes. All right. Okay, so let's clear my screen so I can navigate this thing. All right. The question I'm dealing with for this presentation is, what was Newman's approach to creation? What was the philosophical or theological backing to how he looked at nature and the created order? And then how did this help him in his confrontation with evolution and other developments of modern science? I'll touch on those things kind of at the very end. But the title of the presentation is The Analogy of Nature and Religion in John Henry Newman. So to address this question, I want to describe kind of two sources for Newman's formation that he identified in his famous autobiography, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, or what people just call the Apologia. He tells the kind of story of his intellectual formation, and he cites two important English, therefore Anglican churchmen as having influenced his views. The church fathers were very important, but these two actually he cites before, like in chronological order, these two first. One of them was named Bishop Joseph Butler, and the other one was John Keble. Has anyone ever heard of those people? I knew it. You Catholics don't know. Yes, good job, Jen. You Catholics don't know any Anglican stuff. That's okay. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Butler and Keble and how they influenced Newman. Okay? He had this they influenced him, what I would say, romantic ideals that formed his view of the created order. It may come as something of a surprise that Newman was so untroubled by scientific discoveries of the 19th century. He seemed to not be overly concerned about theories of evolution, discoveries in geology and archaeology and these different sciences. So I want to try to help explain that by looking at his understanding of nature through these figures. Okay? So, turn these things over here. To show this, I want to take us a little journey through Newman's intellectual formation. First, I'll talk about Bishop Joseph Butler, whose influential work called The Analogy of Religion really influenced him. This work was the most influential apologetic work against deism in the 18th century in England and became, in the 19th century, standard theological text at Oxford and Cambridge. And then I want to look at the influence of poetics upon Newman's thought, primarily as they were described by this guy I mentioned, John Keble, who had a collection of poems called The Christian Year, which was the best-selling work of poetry in England in the 19th century. Newman loved it and swore by it. Keble's poetry was romantic and ecclesial. He was inspired by Wordsworth, but remained thoroughly orthodox and high church. His influence upon Newman's life is extensive. So after we cover those two, I will explain how these two influences informed Newman's approach to nature and religion. Specifically, I'll try to attempt to show that Newman was able to absorb the kind of what I call the shocks of the 19th century scientific discoveries because of his understanding of the analogous relationship between nature and revelation. So let us begin with Joseph Butler. Butler lived from 1692 to 1752. He studied at Oriel College, Oxford, which was the same college that Newman studied at 100 years later, or was a fellow at. He eventually became bishop in the Church of England. His target in his writings was deism. Okay, so deists argued that nature was sufficient to prove the existence of God and all that we as human beings need to know about God and the moral life. In other words, for deists, there really was no need for divine revelation. The most influential English deist was Matthew Tyndall. In his book called Christianity as Old as the Creation, he argued that the religion of nature was entirely sufficient on its own, and that anything that has been revealed in Christianity is really just a restating of the religion of nature. Right? Deists believed that God had created an ordered universe from which knowledge of him could be derived with certainty without the aid of any supernatural or miraculous interventions from God. Right? Deism was itself a symptom of the broader Enlightenment movement. Reason, especially empirical reason, aided by the scientific method, was the key to unlocking a future of progress and human flourishing. Deists believed that we could apply reason to study nature, and we would not need supernatural revelation. This wasn't necessary because nature supplied all that was needed for religion and morality. The deists rejected Christianity because the evidence for a supernatural revelation was insufficient to justify belief in it. Deists may have granted that for like the uneducated masses, Christianity served a purpose, but as enlightenment became more widespread, the usefulness of Christianity would go away. For enlightened people, Christian revelation simply did not have the rational evidence sufficient to support certainty of belief in it. So Butler's tactic was to undercut the deists' confidence in appealing to nature as a definitive proof of God and the moral law. He argued that nature was itself filled with anomalies, apparent inconsistencies, and ambiguities. If deists will not accept the Bible because the Bible appears to lack consistency or presents moral difficulties like dark passages, which Ramage knows about, right, so too does nature. Right? Rather than grant the deists' claim that nature is a neatly ordered system that perfectly demonstrates a moral and intelligent creator, and then try to argue that the Bible is also a neatly ordered system that perfectly demonstrates the Trinitarian God, Butler goes the other way. He acknowledges that the evidence for the supernatural claims of Christianity have difficulties, but he asserts that the deists' evidence for their moral governor of the universe is also fraught with difficulties. This means that belief in the deist God and belief in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Jesus Christ, is founded upon probabilities, not mathematical or syllogistic proof. Put another way, deists and Christians must reconcile their beliefs by appeal to probabilistic evidence. Their beliefs are of a similar kind, is what Butler says. Butler's attack on deism was massively influential, and as noted, his analogy was one of the most influential books in the Anglican theology for the next 100 years. But what was important for our purposes is his appeal to analogy. Okay? For Butler's attack on deism, he asserted that there is a correspondence between the order of nature and creation on the one hand, and the order of divine governance and providence on the other hand. Butler asserts the distinct existence of two worlds, one of nature, observable and measurable through scientific analysis, and one of divine revelation, which transcends the observable and measurable. However, the two orders originate in the same source and are sustained and guided by that same source, which is God. Thus, it is to be presumed that the creator of the natural order would so organize his creation according to a pattern that would reflect the pattern of his supernatural revelation. If our understanding of nature has limitations, if our capacity to fully describe nature and reduce it to a system are in fact limited, then it should not surprise us that our capacity to fully describe the supernaturally revealed order is also limited. Okay? Same is true the other way. Okay? If we have a hard time fully explaining divine revelation, then it would not be unlikely that we would have a difficult time fully understanding nature, is what he's saying. And this is the point that Butler is pressing upon his deist interlocutors. If deists think the Bible is filled with difficulties, so too is nature, they say. Right? So you can find an illustration of Newman applying Butler's doctrine of analogy in a lecture he planned to give at the Catholic University of Ireland, which he founded along with the bishops of Ireland in the 1850s, to provide Catholic higher education to Catholic laity in Ireland. Now, I say the lecture was planned because Newman never gave the lecture. He was warned by friends not to give the lecture because it was too controversial, and any negative attention from church officials or the public would have hindered the growth of the university. So Newman opted not to deliver the lecture, but he published it later. Right? So Newman was kind of canceled, right, as we would say today. Newman he got canceled, right? Can't believe it. But why was this essay so controversial? It's kind of interesting. Like, what was he doing, right? Well, in the essay, Newman made the case that Catholicism had nothing to fear from scientific investigation. He asserted a basic maxim that should guide all Catholic intellectuals, which you could summarize as truth cannot be contrary to truth. Second, truth often seems contrary to truth. And third, we must have patience and allow the various disciplines to resolve the seeming or apparent contradiction. That's it. Okay. It may be remarkable to us that today, that a speech was what he would, what we call canceled, because it asserted the unity and compatibility of all truth. But this was the heated climate of the latter half of the 19th century, and the world of science seemed and often presented itself as a threat to traditional Christianity. Okay. So what does he say? In making his defense of the compatibility of Christianity and science, Newman appealed to the doctrine of analogy that he learned from Bishop Butler. Newman noted that not only is theology and divine revelation filled with mystery that escapes our rational categories and explanations, but so too does nature and the created order. In theology, there are doctrines drawn from natural theology, drawn from sacred scripture and divine revelation, that are difficult to explain, to show how they all fit together and connect. Okay? And Newman's fine with granting that. Okay? But like Butler, he turns to the scientists and reminds them that they too assert the existence of realities that they cannot fully explain or demonstrate. And Newman gives several examples from different academic disciplines. And the point is not to call into question the legitimacy of physics or ecology, but to call all parties in the apparent war between science and religion to remember the reality of mystery. Mystery is written into both the realm of nature and the realm of revelation. So in the face of mystery, humans are called to patience and humility. So the influence of Butler's analogy, then Newman says, after that, John Keble influenced and sort of made him see analogy in a new light. Okay? So I think I've got some quotes in here. There we go. Oh yes, there was a quote about from Butler. Right. After Butler, Newman identified the English poet and churchman John Keble as immensely influential in his own formation. When Newman was elected a fellow of Oriel College, he looked up to Keble with awe and admiration. Keble was a poet and a literary scholar, and as I mentioned, his book, The Christian Year, was really like the most influential collection of poetry in the 19th century, despite all the other people you may have heard of in your English classes. It was the best-selling, extremely influential. Newman explained in the Apologia that Keble's poetry reinforced what he had learned from Butler, what Newman called the sacramental system, which he defined as the doctrine, actually I have that up here, the doctrine that material phenomena are both the types and instruments of real things unseen. Okay? This was, as an Anglican, he was thinking like this. What Butler had asserted in the form of apologetic argument, that there's an analogy between the natural and supernatural orders, Keble conveyed in the form of poetry, using symbolic language in a devotional style that fitted this kind of sacramental worldview into the liturgical calendar and made it sort of an ecclesial devotional poetry. So we go from the apologetic to the devotional. This emphasis on poetry is very important for understanding all of Newman's thought. I won't go into all of it, but there's very little in his thinking that cannot be identified with having been informed by his understanding of poetry and poetic theory. Newman made this explicit in 1839 in an essay on the ideals of the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement was this attempt by Newman, John Keble, and others to reclaim and reshape the Church of England, to return it to the theology, spirituality, and sacramental life of the early church. Newman was arguably the most famous of the Oxford movement figures. Their influence was was significant. Catholics today, we can thank the Oxford movement for the Anglican Ordinariate because of the work that they did. So in 1839, at the height of this Oxford movement, Newman wrote an essay titled State of Religious Parties, in which he sought to explain the character and foundational principles of their project. Newman argued that the Oxford movement was the fruit of a spirit afloat that found expression in romantic poetry from people like William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, people you may have heard of, right? The Lake poets. But he said the people in England were hungry for something different, something mystical. They found it in romantic poetry. It was in the midst of this movement that the Oxford movement emerged. The romantic poets awakened the desire for a Christianity more akin to the prayer and worship of the early church. John Keeble's poetry connected this romantic poetry directly to the Anglican liturgical calendar, which further advanced the poetic movement at work in the Church of England. Newman went on to assert, and this says, do I have that up there? There we go. The taste for poetry in modern times being 1830, right, has in a certain sense taken the place of the deep contemplative spirit of the early church. And then he continued, poetry is our mysticism. Right? In the early church, Newman would say mysticism allowed Christians to penetrate below the surface of things and to draw men away from the material to the invisible world. But in the 19th century, it was poetry that was having this effect. Right? Poetry was drawing them into sort of mystical thought and prayer. So it's important here to note the effect that poetry has, according to Newman. Right? Romantic poetry was a reaction to the overly practical, overly literalistic character of the English church, as well as it also attested, like Romanticism is also a literary, philosophical, and religious movement, as well as this reaction against the Enlightenment's rationalistic, mechanistic views of the human person and the natural world. So Butler used this analogy to attack the Enlightenment kind of confidence in their evidences. Keble takes that kind of role of analogy and puts it into poetry and makes it devotional. Okay? And so Newman then has both of these things, and they inform him. And he actually wrote a lot of poetry, and we'll show you a couple things here. So Newman's poetry and devotional meditations give us a glimpse into his romantic sensibilities in respect to nature. In the poem Nature and Art in 1826, at the height of the Romantic movement, Newman praises the beauty and wonder of nature over the art of human hands. He wrote, by arch and spire, by tower-girt heights, he would his boast fulfill. By marble birds and mimic lights, yet lacks one secret still. Where is the master hand shall give, to breathe, to move, to speak, to life? Right. There is a spirit ranging through the earth, the stream, the air, 10,000 shapes, garbs ever new, that busy one doth wear. In color, scent, and taste and sound, the energy of life is found, life with a capital L. Right. It's nature that breathes this life, gives the energy of life with a capital L. And like a good romantic would, right, Newman desires the natural scenes around Oxford more than the lifeless stone Gothic buildings of the university, which are pretty themselves too. But saying like he'd rather walk in the country, right, than be around the stone buildings of Oxford. In another poem, we have a similar kind of touch called "My Lady, Nature, and Her Daughters." Written in 1829, Newman compares the beauty of nature to the beauty of ladies getting dressed up for a ball. Describing the ladies preparing for the ball, he writes, silks where hues alternate play, shawls and scarfs and mantles gay, gold and gems and crisped hair, fling their light o'er lady fair. The ladies use colors, jewels, and various materials as an analogy to Newman is pointing out the ladies' use of colors, jewels, and various materials is an analogy to the variety and the beauty of nature. And I give you the rest of the poem is on there, right? He's using this the beauty that human beings seek in their clothing, ladies in their clothing, and saying that is what lady nature is, right? The beauties of nature, right? And so we get here this, these are poems from kind of the height of the Romantic movement. Newman's under the influence of Keble, and he's seeing in nature signs of God's presence. Okay? But when he gets a little older, okay, the language changes a little bit. And so in 1862, at a particularly low point in Newman's career, he wrote a poem titled The Two Worlds. Here, the stereotypical romantic view of nature has given way to a darker, more ascetical kind of view. Darker might be heavy-handed, but whatever. Unveil, O Lord, on us, on us shine in glory and in grace. This gaudy world grows pale before the beauty of thy face. Till thou art seen, it seems to be a sort of fairy ground, where the sun's unsetting light the sky and flowers and fruits abound. But when thy keener, purer beam is poured upon our sight, it loses all its power to charm, and what was day is night. So where he had nature revealing the beauty of God, now the beauty of God makes nature less attractive, less charming. Right? And he's kind of lost a little bit of that kind of romantic seeing God in nature. And so this is not the first place he mentions this, but this idea comes up in a few other places I want to highlight. Okay? Probably the most famous example of this comes from his autobiography, the Apologia, in a long passage that I can't even put into a PowerPoint slide, it's way too big. I try to condense it down here, right? Newman explains that he struggles with trying to prove the existence of God based on observation of the world around us, in the natural world. He says, I look out of myself into the world of men, and there I see a sight which fills me with unspeakable distress. I am far from denying the real force of the arguments and proof of a God, but these do not warm me or enlighten me. They do not take away the winter of my desolation. The sight of the world is nothing else than the prophet's scroll, full of lamentations and mourning and woe. That doesn't sound like the romantic I heard in the first couple poems, right? Newman really preferred arguments kind of from within, from conscience, as kind of to prove God's existence. As he put it, were it not for this voice, the voice of conscience, speaking so clearly in my heart, I should be an atheist or a pantheist or polytheist when I looked out into the world. Right? The hints are there in the world, but Newman's not so explicit about the distance, or about the distance he perceived between nature and the God of nature. Okay? In his most philosophically rigorous work, An Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent, Newman presents a similar perspective. In an early section of the book, he spoke confidently about the obvious connection between the laws of nature and belief in a divine lawgiver. He argued, a law is not a cause, but a fact. But when we come to the question of cause, is that here? Yeah, there you go. A law, sometimes the quotes get going, right? So you can read them yourself. A law is not a cause, but a fact. But when we come to the question of cause, then, as I have said, we have no experience of any cause but will. The invariableness of law depends on the unchangeableness of that will. From this, Newman concluded, the agency then which has kept up and keeps up the general laws of nature must be mind, with a capital M, and nothing else, and mind, with a capital M, at least as wide and as enduring as the immeasurable ages and spaces of the universe on which that agency has left its traces. Here, Newman confidently and forcefully asserted what is commonly referred to as a design argument. He insists order implies a purpose, and therefore the created order has some purpose for which God continues to guide his creation. So in this instance, Newman appears to present the philosophical argument that flows from the romantic poems of his early period, or his early years. Right? The poet perceives the divine presence in and through nature, and the philosopher deduces the divine mind behind it. Right? But this would be too simple, of course, for Newman. What about the later poem, the one about the nature has lost its charm? Okay? Or the statement from the Apologia where it seems like he looks out on the world and he would be a pantheist if it wasn't for conscience, right? Well, Newman expresses that idea in the Grammar of Assent also. If anyone has ever made it to the back of the book, which very few have, okay, you'll find it in there. He's granting that the created order is one of the primary informants in our understanding of God. Newman reminds us of all of the difficulties that come with natural theology. When we try to prove God's existence and attributes from the created order, Newman argues, what strikes the mind so forcibly and so painfully is his absence, if I may so speak, from his own world. It is silence that speaks. The analogy, end of the quote. How are we doing on that? Yep. We'll come to that one. The analogy of nature seems, in this case, to be an analogy for absence rather than God's presence. The God of nature is not a God of design or order. Instead, he is, Newman says, quote, he is specially a hidden God. Newman then goes on to say, I see only a choice of alternatives in explanation of so critical a fact. Either there is no creator, or he has disowned his creatures, he says. Jeez. Right. Now, Newman does think that there is, in fact, a creator. Okay? He believes in a creator. And he does not think that the creator has disowned his creatures. Instead, it is God speaking through conscience that overcomes this world's like veiling of God's presence. Conscience is the definitive proof for Newman that God exists, and since it is a moral voice, it convicts Newman that he is estranged from God, but that God is not estranged from him. Okay? Thus, the absence or hiddenness of God in nature serves for Newman as an analogy of his own estrangement from God that he's experienced through conscience. So, does nature lead to religious devotion? Like, can you look at nature and become more religious? Right? Newman actually became quite critical of natural theology and was very doubtful of the capacity of nature to inspire religious belief. Newman noted how men who study physical science are so rarely Christians. Not a lot of scientists or Christians at the science fair, they're saying. Right? They're so rarely Christians and instead are often enemies of Christianity. Right? It seems, despite all the sales of romantic poetry in England, that people who take the study of nature as their profession do not often find God and faith through science. Right? Why is this? Newman explained, and this is the quote on the PowerPoint there, "The system of physical causes is so much more tangible and satisfying than that of final causes. It is indeed a great question whether atheism is not as philosophically consistent with the phenomena of the physical world taken by themselves as the doctrine of a creative and governing power." Right? Put another way, it is possible to study the order of nature on its own terms, disconnected from any deeper questions about why nature is the way it is and what the order of nature means. The scientific age has mastered this, and therefore the natural order is capable of being reduced to mere matter and forces. In order to prove God's existence and to inform us of God's attributes, the phenomena of nature require an interpretation. The analogy between creation and creator has to be drawn by the viewer, and that, Newman argues, so rarely happens. Newman says, unless there is a pre-existent and independent interest in the inquirer's mind, leading him to dwell on the phenomena which betoken an intelligent creator, he will certainly follow out those which terminate in the hypothesis of a settled order of nature and a self-sustained laws. In other words, unless this person already has faith, right, and wants to interpret nature in a way of seeing design, they will just stop with the material causes and things of nature. The interpreter, so he goes on to say, science gives us the grounds and premises from which religious truths are to be inferred, but it does not set about inferring them. This is why science has so little of a religious tendency. Deductions have no power of persuasion. And then he goes on to say, I would rather be bound to defend the reasonableness of assuming Christianity is true than to demonstrate a moral governance from the physical world. Tell men to gain notions of a creator from his works, and if they were to set about it, which nobody does, he puts that in parentheses there, they would be jaded and wearied from the labyrinth they were tracing. Sorry, I didn't put that whole one up there. Right. But he's saying, right, like, if you tell people, go out and study science, go walk in the woods and study and take in the trees, and then also like try to study it, he said, very rarely are they going to become theists because they've studied nature or they've walked in nature. It's kind of a shocking, I think, in some ways, how skeptical Newman is of the persuasiveness of the arguments for God's existence based on nature and design. From where we started with his praise of Butler's analogy and Keeble's sacramental vision, it would seem that Newman would be more confident in the power of nature to reveal God. But this is not exactly what we find. Has Newman given up on the doctrine of analogy? Does he talk piously about the sacramental system at work in the world and then give way to doubt when push comes to shove? I think the opposite is true. I think that Newman continues to rely upon his doctrine of analogy, and that this is what informs his approach to reconciling faith and science in the modern world. So to this I'll turn and try to bring this paper to a close here. Okay? We need coffee, though. Here we go. For the home stretch. Okay. While the 19th century was filled with challenges to traditional beliefs in Christianity, one of the most significant and long-lasting came from the popularization of Darwin's theory of evolution. Newman was noteworthy in his relative calm regarding the theory of evolution. This has been kind of cited in lots of different places. Dr. Ramage will mention more of them coming up. This I attribute to the doctrine of analogy he learned from Butler and Keeble. The analogy of nature and the analogy of religion cut both ways. Okay? Revelation is not a revelation of a systematic set of completed doctrines. Rather, God's revelation is the revelation of mystery. As he put it, no revelation can be complete and systematic from the weakness of the human intellect. Thus, religious truth is neither light nor darkness, but both together. Right? Religious truth, revelation is going to be light and darkness together. Similarly, if we are to follow the analogy, nature is also mysterious. The more scientists discover, the more questions they come up with. One discovery leads to an upheaval in other areas, and reconciling with the new discovery leaves open new questions and reveals new difficulties. Thus, when Newman learns of Darwin's theory of evolution, he's open to the possibility that the natural order involves much greater complexity than humans had previously imagined. As I mentioned, Dr. Ramage is going to go into this a little bit more, so I will not spend time going deeper into the background on that, but I want to highlight a couple of statements Newman made, and they're up on the screen there, in letters regarding evolution. He got a lot of letters from people asking him, like, okay, help me through this, help me understand what's going on with this evolution thing. And Newman would spend hours a day writing correspondence, and his arm would just had to be so tired. First, he argued that Darwin's theory was not incompatible with the idea of God as creator or as designer of the natural order. Newman asserted, "It does not seem to me to follow that creation is denied because the creator, millions of years ago, gave laws to matter, laws which should construct it into its present wonderful beauty and accurate adjustment and harmony of its parts gradually." Newman went on to say, "As to the divine design, is it not an instance of incomprehensibility and infinitely marvelous wisdom and design to have given certain laws to matter millions of years ago?" And then as he goes on, lose the page here. There we go. Oh, there we go, yeah, okay. In both instances, whether referring to God as creator or as designer, Newman saw the analogy of nature and religion as being confirmed, rather than denied through the theory of evolution. He concluded, "I do not see that the accidental evolution of organic beings is inconsistent with divine design. It is accidental to us, from our perspective, not to God." That is to say, on our side of God's creation, the changes in nature and in history appear to be without design or intent. They are accidents to us. But is not the course of salvation history filled with accidents as well? The history of the Jewish people, the history of the New Testament, the history of the church would be considered filled with accidents if we did not bring to them the eye of faith. Did Jesus accidentally meet his apostles? Did Paul accidentally escape death at sea before arriving safely at Rome? Because of the doctrine of analogy that Newman had learned, and through his poetic kind of sacramental view of reality, he saw that mystery was one more on there, that's it, good. He saw that mystery was the primary reality of God's dealings with his creation. Thus, it should not surprise us that nature is filled with difficulties any more than we are faced with difficulties in the study of divine revelation. To recall another of Newman's famous sayings, and we'll end it with this, 10,000 difficulties does not make one doubt. Thanks.
That was tremendous. Hey, Dr. Muller, would you take your computer away? Oh, oops. What did I do? Oh, could you unplug it? Yeah. Sorry about that. Thank you. I'll switch to HDMI here, see how that goes. Okay. That's a perfect segue with what I want to do here. Let's plug that in. Should be good. Takes a second, but it should show up. All else fails, you just plug, replug, see what happens. That's a good sign. Go in the right direction. Yes. Look at that. Patience is rewarded. So this is the theme of my talk. Reason is the greatest enemy that faith has. Not actually, but yeah, I'm titling this after my chapter in the book that we are honoring here. My article title is A Larger Idea of Divine Skill, Newman and Ratzinger on Creation and Evolution. That's a line from Newman that larger idea of divine skill. So guys, I think it's appropriate to start with Richard Dawkins. You see, before Darwin came along, it was hard to be a satisfied atheist. But Darwin made it easy, right? That's the essence of this quote. So this has set up the warfare model between science and religion that we see still raging today. This is actually a sign that my wife and I ran across. Unfortunately, when I went to internet to find a picture of it, because I didn't take a picture of it 20 years ago, there were a bunch of signs like this. So this isn't the very one we saw, but I remember distinctly at grad school at Ave Maria driving by a church in Naples, Florida, and it had this, and I thought, I'm going to write this pastor, explain to him the truth of things, and I realized I had a couple papers due. So the church, in her contemplation of creation, that marvelous beauty that Newman speaks of, it's fundamentally a positive view, but there are errors we want to avoid. So in his Fides et Ratio, John Paul II said we want to avoid scientism, science good, scientism not. The notion that only truth can come through the empirical science. On the other hand, Benedict echoed his predecessors in saying that the church always has rejected fideism, literally in Latin, faithism, to believe against reason, to believe because the scientists, believe something because the scientists say the opposite. So we want to avoid that as well, not to be drinking the Kool-Aid of anything. That's not a technical word from the Pope, that's mine. But you see that now in the classical tradition, like Dr. Muller referred to, truth can't contradict truth. Aquinas says that all truth, no matter its source, is of the Holy Spirit. And Aquinas dared to use a pagan to really ground his philosophy, which was pretty renegade at the time. His bishop definitely didn't like it, banned his books. This is an image of the Israelites plundering the Egyptians on their way out on the Exodus, which the fathers interpret as taking all goods no matter where they're from. So I wanted to briefly talk about the church's actual position on evolution in the faith, go into a little bit of Pope Benedict, we'll get into Newman, and do a little fun picture time, and then the philosophical and theological implications. So you can read these for yourself, but one interesting thing is Newman was notable at a time when there was much less evidence for Darwin's theory, for saying this is fundamentally compatible. Catholic Encyclopedia, 1909, you see here, has no problem. It actually uses the word perfect agreement with the Christian conception of the universe. There was an apologetics work called the Question Box at the time that said perfectly free are Catholics to accept it. The only papal encyclical on the subject said that the human body may have taken origin from pre-existent matter, i.e. hominins, proto-humans, as long as we hold the important statement, the spiritual soul was created directly by God. And I love Pius XII. He's so balanced. Like when he declared Mary's Assumption, he doesn't say whether she died or not, even though it's pretty clear, I think, that he thinks Mary died, because every church father he seems to quote in there says Mary died. But he leaves open whether or not she died. And he says at the end of her earthly pilgrimage, Mary was taken up. That's what you have to believe. But so in the encyclical here, where he deals with evolution, I think he seems to be rooting against it in a way, but he definitely doesn't say you can't hold it. So then by the time John Paul II rolls around, in the 80s and in the 90s, he famously calls it more than a hypothesis. And then the International Theological Commission, in a document that doesn't really have much weight other than Cardinal Ratzinger signed off on it, which was nice, it talks about the theory of evolution being virtually certain, that life arose, give or take, 3.5 billion years ago via converging evidence in multiple fields. It's virtually certain that all organisms descended from the first organism. But the church is never going to define evolution as something you have to believe, because it's not an essential faith matter. How about Benedict? I just gave you 3 little nuggets from Pope Benedict, who thought about this for decades. He speaks of many proofs in favor of it. My favorite line is he says, we cannot say creation or evolution. These are answers to different questions. The empirical way the world was made versus why God did it. Well, who did it? What's it for? What's our vocation? Things like that. So to put it in Benedictine college terms, there are questions that Westerman Hall is expert in. There are questions that we over here try to be expert in. But at a certain point, as the saying goes, you get your PhD and you realize no one knows anything either. So, yes. This one here, the final one's interesting because he's talking to an atheist, a mathematician who's a fascinating guy, Odifredi, and he's taking on the objection that evolution disproves God, and he's like, come on, no one really thinks it's not the case. I find that's funny because Benedict hasn't been to America and talked about this topic, obviously. Not everybody, sees it as he sees it, but he's been to America, but I don't know if he had the lay of the land there. A few other fun quotes, some of my favorite people out there. Chesterton, if evolution simply means a positive thing called an ape turned very slowly into a positive thing called a man, it's stingless for the most orthodox. Personal God might as well just do things slowly as quickly. So that's kind of cool. Fulton Sheen, evolution as a theory of the process of the universe is legitimate. It just talks about how things grow and develop. And Newman, I see nothing in the theory of evolution inconsistent with the Almighty Creator. Mr. Darwin's theory need not be atheistical. Gotta love the 19th century adjective. It may simply be suggesting a larger idea of divine prescience and skill, foreknowledge and skill. That doesn't prove evolution, it just shows it's actually the mainstream science, and it's the mainstream kind of direction of the church she'll go, even though she doesn't define it. So I want to now go into Newman's epistemology, his theory of knowledge. So this actually is really important, his essay, An Aid of a Grammar of Assent. He goes through and talks about how you come to knowledge, and there are different ways this occurs. It's its own evening symposium. He says that there are two great circles of knowledge, basically faith and reason, and they have different methods. Well, empirical sciences, as a lot of you would know if you're science majors, it's inductive. You work through evidence and you will build up to a theory. Newman calls this converging probabilities or accumulation of evidences. And so each one of these in itself would not be a fail-proof thing that you would definitely rely on, but they build up to a greater certitude than you would have each on its own. So, funny one, I like to use this in class. He can't prove his father is not a murderer. And yet, it would not only be heartless, but irrational not to disbelieve someone who said, my dad was a murderer. The other example I like here is, it's like a cable. I used to fish in the Gulf of Mexico a decent amount. You use braided fishing wire. So like a cable, it's made of individual strands. Then the separate threads, each on its own, may be weaker, but it cumulatively amasses to a certitude. And he says, this is how Great Britain, being an island, is something we know. Like, Great Britain is an island nation, but Newman's aware that he cannot prove to you beyond every possible objection that Great Britain's an island. There's always some objection you can have. Well, I could go walk around it. Nowadays, he could say, here's a video camera, but just think about it. Someone could say, now that's AI, right? But at a certain point, it's silly not to think Great Britain's an island. It's silly to think your dad's a murderer unless you have good evidence that your dad is a murderer and things like that. So we want an explanation of things for Newman of what's actually plausible, not what's just technically possible. So I'm a lover of the sciences. I have a little bit of background. I love to study it. I'm a armchair naturalist. I like to get out in nature, so I guess I'm a unofficial naturalist. And for philosophy majors, I'm using that in the biology sense, not an atheist, but one who loves nature and tries to spend time in it. So having said that, these are pretty basic things here, but evolution as a theory, it's not just a theory the way we use it today. I like what Father Nicanor Austriaco says, who's a biologist, Dominican theologian. He says, it's a theory in the sense of gravity is a theory. It's a theory in the sense of plate tectonics is a theory. But usually plate tectonics doesn't bother people's faith, right? So, but And there's a reason for that. Evolution, as my wife likes to remind me, well, it only makes you rethink everything. And so it's understandable if you have sensitivity to the topic, it's not because of some ill will. It's complicated. But the theory of evolution here is a well-substantiated explanation of observed facts, observation, experiment, etc. And so in philosophy of science, one thing I've studied, you don't prove a scientific theory, it fails to be rejected. You're actually, at least my understanding of science is you're not doing science if you're not open to it being falsified. But you don't turn around and then say you don't think it's right. So this is a thing we kind of perfected in America is here's a gotcha, and therefore you don't have knowledge. Well, I know my wife is in here tonight, but she's right there. But I usually say I can't prove my wife is not out partying right now. And yet I'm utterly confident. In fact, I'm fairly confident, usually, she's changed a diaper within the last hour. Here's a fun one. We went to Meteor Crater in Arizona, and they tell the story there. They did NASA training down there at the bottom. There's a thingy down there that's a house that looks like a speck. They wondered, hypothetically, was it a volcano or was it maybe a meteor? And they actually didn't figure it out until Los Alamos when someone came along and said, oh, I know what caused that thing. It turns out it was a meteor. Well, then where was the meteor? They couldn't find the meteor. So they dug under the ground and didn't find it. Well, they found bits of it, and this is, I think, the biggest one. That thing weighs basically a ton. But they found little bits, it hit so hard, it disintegrated it. So that ended up becoming the dominant explanation. And so you kind of move toward that direction when you have a web of evidence. And so this is my kind of favorite part, is I love just looking at nature. Some of the reasons why in looking at the marvels of nature, we think things evolved. Before I really get into my theology part, you look at the fossil record, we can look at things like whale evolution. People used to say there are no transitional species. That's obviously not a real picture. That's a computer trying to trace what we have got through the fossil evidence of creatures that they like hippo-like DNA, but they appear apparently anatomically to be more like a wolf, but they begin to get into water. And you look at whales, it's fascinating, as I'll come back to in a minute. They're not fish. I've actually heard theologians call whales fish. Actually, I won't name my buddy, but he said that. And we like to make fun of the Miami Dolphins by calling them the fish, okay? But yeah, we can trace whale evolution, we can trace human evolution. Homo erectus were upright by 2 million years ago. It's not a straight line, it's more like a bush. This is the Smithsonian. But when you look at the Australopithecines 7-6 million years ago, they're quite different from what we see a couple million years ago with Homo erectus, making sophisticated stone tools, doing things like perhaps even making fire. You're not going to see chimps make that. They split off 6 million years ago. The real debate amongst people like me who are largely Thomistic that we had a conference on last summer is kind of when exactly was this and how did God work through it? So we're not really so much debating that it happened as to like how does this all fit together. So you can look at transitional structures like the evolution of the eye gradually from a pigment kind of catching light, giving it a survival advantage to move up or down in the water, to gradually focusing the lens. You can look at wing evolution. Yeah, this cassowary, I don't want to come across that in nature. Yeah, and even chickens, if you get one running at your face, which I've done, it's not exactly unscary. So the survivors of them. I had a snakehead one time. I think this is illegal to have in your fish aquarium now. But I didn't know at the time when I was growing up that the snakehead, which they've released out in the Everglades, and I love the Everglades, but they're now a problem. They have a proto-lung, and they can wiggle across the ground into another canal and infest it as well. So these are the discoveries. Like I look forward to you students who will be able to do this thing I can't do. I'm a theologian. I only have so much expertise working through these sorts of things. But think about the third thing, vestigial structures. Like my dad had the ability to move his ear. I don't know if some of you guys can. but it's the vestige of times when, well, it was a survival advantage. Or there's the weird ones like, why does your hair get raised? Well, turns out that's a remnant of something that used to be useful, like when my cat puffs himself up. The tailbone, coccyx, what the heck? I don't have an appendix anymore. We have remnants of vitellogenin egg-laying DNA in us. Why? Proto-ancestors. Comparative anatomy, back to the whales. I learned this from one of our biologists here. I never knew about this. The whale has a remnant pelvis. That's kind of cool. Why does it have a pelvis? Why do whales have hands? They're not fins like fish. They have flippers that have hands in them. Atavisms. This is one of my favorite ones. I've never seen one of these sorts of things like in the real, but I would love to. So chickens with teeth, that'd be really cool. They reactivate an old genetic trait. Babies with tails. I know a priest who was on an ethics committee at a hospital discussing, like, what do we do about this case? You know, it'd be pretty cool to have a tail. It might be quite inconvenient to have a tail. But you have a reactivation of a long dormant ancestral trait due to a genetic malfunction. And you know, like, why else would that be? Kind of back to Newman, that's a pretty weird God designing the baby that would poof that thing out. Because embryonically, as you develop, you have a vestigial like tail and it gets reabsorbed. It's programmed cell death. And then genetically, this thing gets reactivated. Biogeography, this is my daughter Michaela at the Petrified Forest National Park, highly recommended. But they have a little puzzle of Pangaea, the supercontinent there. And so we can see how certain things live in certain places, and they evolve separately after the land splits. Like think about, we had the Western Interior Sea out in central Kansas. Here we were Pennsylvanian, so if you find fossils here, they're like bivalves. Out there you find mosasaurs. But it's that sort of splitting that leads to things like cool species. I want to throw in a little Yellowstone. I'm proud of this picture, first of all. But the Yellowstone supervolcano has been moving as the plates shift. And we got to go to what's that called, Jen? Craters of the Moon National Monument. And one day Yellowstone's going to look like this, because it's sitting on top of the volcano right now. So with the plate tectonics and moving the land and splitting the continents, like you get Aussie marsupials. Why do they have there? They evolved after the split. Why are tomatoes only in the Americas? Well, they evolved here. And Italian food originally did not have tomatoes. I'm told it was actually not nearly as good until America made it great. And things like that. This is not a real picture of a dinosaur, but so apparently the dinosaurs were in Antarctica. Isn't this amazing stuff? And what I like to do when we travel is think about how God prepared the world for all these millions of years for us to be here. I know biologists sometimes don't like that language, but I have a professor coming on Friday to say just that. So if you want to follow up on man being the purpose of creation, come on Friday. I know our biology students do fruit fly experiments. I think you guys usually mess it up, my understanding. But tracing the evolution of a virus or a fruit fly. And then my favorite one, actually, besides like the atavisms are cool, but thinking about genetics, I mean, we didn't even have the genome mapped when I was in college studying bio. And then I like eventually dropped out and did seminary and almost got killed and then became a theologian. But the, like just as a language gradually evolves, and you know, Latin gradually, depending on where you're geographically split off, becomes Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, etc. That's the way evolution works. You speciate because you're split and you're not breeding anymore. And one cool thing is, so we can see now genetically that humans are closest to chimps, then gorillas, then orangutans. And the scientists have a pretty good idea of when these lineages broke. And yeah, those are cute. It's commonly said we share about 98% of our DNA with chimps and bonobos. It does not make us the same. It's not like 98% similar. But we should not be surprised if we have commonality with them. And I took this chart from a really cool book I recommend. It's It's called Adam and the Genome by a pair of evangelical Christians. And they're going through in here and showing, okay, well, look at the start with the humans. But then with chimps, they don't share that 249 insertion. So something happened and the nucleotide got inserted, it screwed up, and I'll have to remember all my genetics, and screwed up the translation of it. So we have this genetic mutation they don't have. Well, the chimps have those three, but the gorillas are missing the 430 deletion. Well, the explanation for that's pretty easy. The chimps have it, but the gorillas don't have it because it happened after the split. And then, well, the orangutans have this 236 stop, the translation stopped. So you can see that the orangutans here, and I think I misspoke, but why did they have that same thing in common? The plus is supposed to be shared. So the humans have these things that the chimps don't have because they occurred after we split. The chimps have what the gorillas don't have after the split. And the orangutan is like the base level here. He has all those genes being normal except that one mutation. So that's a good book, Adam and the Genome. But now I want to turn to how God actually fits into all this. So it's not a matter of God versus nature, but God and nature for Catholics. It's important from a Thomistic point of view. He's not just a cause that intervenes. He's the source of being. He gives us natures. So like Steve Barr, the head of Society of Catholic Scientists, says, God exercises vertical causality. He gives us being, and then we exercise horizontal causality, intervening in the world because we're all in it together. Now, God can intervene directly. We call it a miracle. But usually he works through secondary causes. Ratzinger says, the marvel is he works not next to, but precisely through nature. So like in conception, Jen and I have contributed to 7 kids and 1 in the womb, so we've contributed to 8 children being conceived. God did not have to intervene genetically, but we do say there's something Jen and I did not do. We did not create that baby's soul, right? So I like what Pope Francis says. When you think about these sorts of things, you can go study the problems. Get out there, scientists. But it's much less a problem than a joyful mystery to be contemplated. So to continue that contemplation, here's Michaela. She's the star of the show tonight, walking amidst some dinosaur footprints in Utah. But why did God even bring dinosaurs into the picture? Well, it's a greater perfection, not just to be good, but to be a cause of goodness in other creatures. The dinosaurs were given dignity of playing a role in the evolution of life. We are given a dignity. In Conway's question box, he actually has an interesting comparison. If you have a billiards player who can hit each ball individually in the pocket, one by one, that's pretty good. But back to Newman, what if you had a billiards player who could set up the world so that while he maintained it in being and was intimately involved, he gave the capacity to set off a chain of events that operates by its own internal structure, on its own, as it were. It's a fine line between that and deism, though. God, we Catholics hold, even though he usually works through natural structures, he's the very one more intimate to us than we are to ourselves. And I like this line from Newman. The dinosaur picture's here because apparently he had a friend or someone he was talking to who said that God placed the fossils in the rocks to make it look like we evolved. And Newman says, I'll either go whole hog with Darwin. Now, first of all, I'm a barbecue guy, so this pleases me. I'll go whole hog with Darwin or dispense with time and history altogether and hold not only that species were created fully formed, but the rocks were created with fossils in them. So he's like, if you're going to go fideist, go all the way, man, is basically how I read that line. Here's one I owe to my wife. We're both lovers of Dante. We taught the Divine Comedy in Florence back in 2012. And, sorry for the spoiler, but he ends the whole thing with the love that moves the sun and the other stars. And as Jen says, the discovery of gravity did not prove Dante wrong. God does still move them, but he moves them through the causes he gave the dignity to share in his work. So evolution doesn't make God any less involved with our world than gravity does, and what human conception does. And so here's another analogy my wife and I have talked about over the years: fetal development. Right now, we're in about week 20. Jen just started feeling the baby kick. You know, you begin, and I mean you, we believe as Catholics, and it's scientifically grounded, you are substantially a person as a zygote when sperm and egg come together. You're a blastocyst, nice little clump. You go through your alien stage. You know, you have the sort of primordial tail that gets reabsorbed, your little shrimp stage. I think our baby's about palm size right now. Cool 3D sonograms. That was one of our last kids. I won't tell you the name so I don't embarrass them, but that was a pretty good sonogram, I thought. That's a 12-week sonogram. But eventually you get that. And guess what my source for these pictures besides the sonogram was? Richard Dawkins. But is it right to respond to discoveries of embryology? No, embryology is wrong. The Bible says, God knit me together in my mother's womb. You see how that would be illiterate? So again, I owe this to my lovely wife, thinking through these mysteries. It's both and. We can truly affirm with Psalm 139 that God knit us together, yet he did through this marvelous world he created. And so the science of evolution from a Catholic point of view no more contradicts God's creation of species than embryology does his creation of babies. And it's actually, in my like, spirituality, I find it even more beautiful. I think Newman's right. It might even suggest a larger idea of God's grandeur that he does this. And so that's something to ponder. And we'll have Q&A here at the end. We'll have a little panel. But I wanted to end my part with just a couple of quotes. So in his famous Regensburg address of 2006, Pope Benedict says, we have to have the courage to engage the full breadth of reason. He says the fear to ask the serious questions of faith and science is actually a betrayal of a lack of faith. And so let's go there. We need Catholics to be at the university, to take up these questions and enter into the debates of our time. And I'm really excited about you guys here at Benedictine for that reason. I'm blessed to be here. Then there's Newman's line, right? That idea that maybe God is even more glorified if he creates babies through means of humans and creates species over billions of years. But there's still much theology to be done. And so with that, I will wrap my part up, guys. And we are going to have time for a 5-minute little cookie break and coffee and stuff. And we'll have Father de Gaal. He's going to be the cleanup batter. And Father de Gaal is an expert in many things. He knew Ratzinger. He's going to talk on Ratzinger and ecology. So let's take a 5-minute break, guys, and I'll kind of start yelling in the microphone and call us back together. Thank you. All right, guys, I hope the cookies and everything are good. I'm going to introduce our final speaker. All right, so enjoy your coffee, grab last things. All right, guys, Father Emery de Gaal. We're pleased to have him here. He's Professor of Dogmatic Theology at University of St. Mary the Lake, Mundelein Seminary in Chicagoland. He's a world-renowned scholar of the thought of Joseph Ratzinger, and as I said before, he knew him. He was telling us Ratzinger stories over dinner. He holds an advanced degree from the University of Munich and a doctorate in systematic theology from Duquesne. A professor, associate pastor, and member of the Catholic Protestant Ecumenical Dialogue in Nuremberg, Germany, Father de Gaal is a member of the American Academy of Religion, the American Benedictine Academy, where he was, I think, just recently speaking at a conference, the Catholic Theological Society of America, the Medieval Catholic Academy of America, the Société Internationale des Médiévistes, I do actually know French, but Médiévistes, and the International Mariological Society. Among his many academic achievements are his book, The Art of Equanimity, a study in the theological hermeneutics of St. Anselm of Canterbury, and my favorite of his, The Theology of Pope Benedict XVI, The Christocentric Shift. So please join me in welcoming Father Emery de Gaal.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Matthew Ramage, for inviting me. I thank the Benedictines for hosting me. So I'm from Mundelein Seminary. We have at present 127 seminarians, total enrollment 700, and some of our seminarians are graduates from Benedictine College, and we're grateful for the formation and training they have received here. Since the 1970s, the protection of our environment has not only been a concern for society, but also for the Church. Statements by the last three popes, St. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis clearly show this. The idea of a Christian-inflected anthropocentrism is reflected in these popes. On May 8, 1993, the Pope, John Paul II, had a veritable outburst of emotion at the Sicilian Ettore Majorana Research Center. In a speech to scientists, he spoke of the danger of an olocausto ambientale, an environmental holocaust, which had replaced the threat of an olocausto nucleare, a nuclear holocaust, prevalent during the Cold War. This highly controversial phrase makes clear how seriously St. John Paul II took the environmental issue. This highly explosive, but perhaps prophetic diction makes clear how dear the environmental issue was for St. John Paul II, who is associated with many other things, but not with environmental protection. The sharpness of the rhetoric employed should not come as a surprise. Since the 1970s, environmental protection has been a core concern of the Church's preaching, based on the motif of the preservation of creation as God's mandate to humankind. Quote, "So the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it." Genesis 2:15. The gospel of life embraces life as such without abandoning the special position of the human being. Pope Benedict XVI is a pope of environmental action. He intensified efforts to find a Catholic response to the ecological question. Benedict was even considered the Green Pope. This was what US diplomats called him behind closed doors, as revealed by the WikiLeaks platform. At the International Youth Meeting in Loreto in September 2007, Benedict preached about the Church's commitment to environmental and climate issues. Quote, "One of the areas where work seems urgent is undoubtedly the preservation of creation. The future of the planet has been entrusted to new generations, where the signs of a development that has not yet always been able to protect the delicate balances of nature are evident. Before it is too late, it is necessary to make courageous decisions that will rebuild a strong bond between humanity and the earth. This is not a populist manifesto for the Fridays for Future movement, but a bold call to young people to get involved in ecological issues. The Holy Father also addressed the environmental issue several times at the World Youth Day in Sydney 2008. These words were followed by actions. It was Pope Benedict XVI who, as early as 2008, had a solar power plant the size of a football field built in the Vatican. This saves around 225 tons of carbon dioxide annually. Unsurprisingly, the Vatican was awarded the European Solar Prize 2008 for this project. Faith in creation as the indispensable basis. Already the young theologian Josef Ratzinger is no stranger to criticism of the human modern person. Even as early as in 1968, Ratzinger, in his famous best-selling Introduction to Christianity, 1968, analyzes the determining forces of the modern age and problematizes a one-sided mathematical, technical, feasibility-oriented reason with which humankind wants to make the earth and ultimately his fellow human beings submissive to techne, the Greek word for technology, in English maybe. He is influenced by the precursor of liturgical renewal, Romano Guardini, and his prophetic book, Letters from Lake Como, Explorations in Technology and the Human Race, first published in 1927. In this far-sighted book, Guardini described how modern technology challenges the human being in his relationship to nature and the implications technology will have on culture and society. A perilous alienation, alienatio, we know it from Augustine, from creation and from its creator sets in. As Pope Benedict XVI, Ratzinger summarized his reflections under the heading Human Ecology, which has since been illuminated and explored in greater depth in a number of collections of texts and conference proceedings. In addition to a section in his social encyclical Caritas in Veritate, number 51, and in his address to the German Bundestag, or Diet Parliament, on September 22, 2011, on the foundation of law, he spoke about this in particular in his Christmas address to the cardinals and the Roman Curia in December of 2008. First and foremost, it is remarkable that the Pope uses the word ecology to take up a demand advocated by more left-wing political and social groups and links it to Christianity. Quote, "The ultimate reason for our responsibility for the earth lies in our faith in creation. It is not simply our property that we can exploit according to our interests and desires," unquote. Man is not only concerned with the preservation of his own habitat, but even more profoundly with the insight into the spirit-worked and spirit-filled nature of matter of the cosmos. There are inner orders inscribed in nature that need to be understood and respected, which are beyond human control or even manipulation. Quote, "The fact that the earth reflects the creative power also means that its spiritual structures also carry moral instructions," unquote. Seen in this way, nature points itself beyond itself to the one who made it and continues to work in it, to the creative power and spirit of God, who speaks to us through the works of creation and thus, quote, "shows us the way of right living," unquote. Polarity and complementarity. Here, Pope Benedict XVI goes a decisive step further than the generally widespread understanding of ecology as the protection of nature, because man is not opposed to creation, but is himself part of creation. Ecology, the endeavor to understand and protect the natural conditions of life, must also apply to himself. Quote, "There must be such a thing as an ecology of man," unquote. Respect for the order of creation, which is intrinsically part of man and therefore also given to him. This includes the reality of two genders, the polarity and complementarity of the two genders, and thus also the special protection of marriage between man and woman as a foundational sacrament of creation that cannot be redefined at will by a self-enamored homo faber. The Pope sees the great danger and crisis of the present day in the fact that man is not only detaching himself, but also himself from his creator and destroying himself under the pretense of complete self-emancipation from the ultimate laws that have bound him up to now. Quote, "The rainforests deserve our protection, but no less the human being as a creature inscribed with a message that is not the antithesis of our freedom, but its condition," unquote. In this context, Benedict XVI deliberately mentions gender theory, which cannot be used as a key witness for the artificial emancipation of the genders, because it strives for the artificial elimination of all gender norms and denies any natural, that is God-given, predetermination of the human being. However, this theory also denies implicitly the inherent goodness of creation and the human being, something that is seen far too little by its sympathizers. In this way, it unintentionally confirms that at the deepest level, man cannot call himself good, cannot accept himself, and cannot love himself if he is not granted this from outside, from others, ultimately from God, who is the summum bonum, the highest good. Cynicism sets in as the only alternative. If the cosmos is the result of a giant lottery, a la Pascual Jordan, a German theoretical and mathematical physicist, not a personal will, but solely chance causes the world and us. The meaning of creation. For Pope Benedict XVI, as for the Catholic mind in general, the marital union of man and woman reflects the meaning of creation, and thus also of the ecology of man, as can be seen from other texts he has written. Quote, "The true vocation of creation is to be a space for the covenant, for the yes of love between God and humanity, which responds to him," unquote. Thus, in a sermon on March 26, 2012 in Santiago de Cuba, the covenant between God and creation is made sacramentally present in the marriage covenant between man and woman. This is why a special blessing lies upon them, the mystery of fertility and new life, without which humanity would have ceased to exist long ago. According to Pope Benedict XVI, the crisis of marriage and partnership in the Western world is also an effect of the decreasing reference to God in public life and the silent farewell of entire generations to commitment to church and Christian practice. In a pilgrimage sermon, while still a cardinal, he said, quote, "If the basic relationship, the relationship with the one who created and sustains us, is no longer right, then all other relationships also change and ultimately fall apart," unquote. Then, all that remains is the desperate search for a substitute, for example, in Far Eastern meditations, or even worse, in occultism, drug consumption, or other risky adventures. And in the end, he predicted, quote, "There is weariness, hatred of life, which no longer seems good and really worth living," unquote. Thus, in a sermon on March 26, 1988, in the lovely Marian Pilgrimage Church in the Bavarian town of Maria Thalheim. "For without God, man cannot be sure, and no philosophy or policy, no matter how social, can guarantee that it is good to live, despite all the problems and crises every generation anew must face. In the image of God, the ecology of humanity, which Pope Benedict XVI inscribed in the German parliament, and thus on the entire Western democracy, is something of a barometer for the future of humankind. How it meets the great challenges of the 21st century, whether it secures its future on the green planet or gambles it away, will depend essentially on whether humanity once again sees itself as who it is and should be, God's beloved image, which even as an overturned image, thus Gregory of Nyssa, in self-alienation and distance from God, reveals the traces of its creator, who hears and respects, quote, "the language of creation," unquote, in his own life, and thus also in his fellow human beings and in nature, and who does not misinterpret his own creatureliness as a dependency that must be cast off, but as a calling in covenant and friendship with his creator, quote, "willed by an eternal love and destined for his eternal love," unquote. Thus, in a sermon delivered on October 2, 2004, at the Austrian shrine of Mayatzen. St. Gregory of Nyssa had called the human soul a free and living mirror, that gazing upon the face of its lover, the Word of God, Jesus Christ, is adorned with his comeliness. By looking on Jesus, one becomes what he is. The Pope and Human Ecology. Only when humanity learns to read the book of nature, again, as Pope Benedict XVI eloquently demonstrated during his pontificate, will it find a way out of the many crises in which it has become entangled and have a future. The pontificate of the 265th Pope of the Holy Roman Catholic Church lasted only 8 years, yet it will take 80 years rather than another 8 for the faithful to unearth all the treasures that the Holy Father bequeathed to the Church of Jesus Christ in these extremely dense years. So exceptionally pronounced is the capacity to integrating thinking in this successor of Peter, that it is anything but surprising that even among the well-intentioned few are able to keep pace with him. Among the many wonderfully polished spiritual jewels that this highly learned yet extremely humble shepherd of the church left behind, not only to Christians, but to the entire world, undoubtedly his proclamation of the ecology of man. Quote, "I would like," when he addressed the German Bundestag, "I would like to underline a point that seems to me to be neglected. Today, as in the past, there is also an ecology of man," unquote. Humans, the Pope continued, also have a nature that they must respect and that they cannot manipulate at will. Man does not create himself. He is intellect and will, but he is also nature, and his will is rightly ordered if he respects his nature, listens to it, and accepts himself for who he is. As one who did not create himself in this way, and in no other, is true human freedom fulfilled, unquote. Anyone who honestly engages with the encyclicals, sermons, speeches, and books of Joseph Ratzinger and Benedict XVI quickly realizes that it is not merely a true scholar sharing his wealth of knowledge, but rather one of the few great sages is speaking here, one who has penetrated everything he teaches down to the very last corner, with heart and mind, with measured passion. Perhaps, therefore, the world will one day have to understand Benedict XVI's resignation from the office of Vicar of Christ, who apparently no longer considers himself sufficiently equipped to steer the ship of Peter safely through the storms of the present, in light of these words. The will of man, quote, is right when he pays attention to nature, listens to it, and accepts himself as he is and as he has not made himself, unquote. What seems certain, however, is that humanity, which is increasingly enslaving itself almost everywhere, will only be granted a halfway prosperous future in the long run if it learns to spell anew what the Pope set out during his last official visit to his homeland, as well as elsewhere with his talk on the ecology of man. Already in his last encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, Love and Truth, issued on June 29, 2009, Benedict intoned the theme of human ecology. Starting with humanity's responsibility for creation, the Holy Father explicitly addresses the right to life in this teaching. Quote, to protect nature, it is not enough to intervene with incentive or restrictive measures, nor is appropriate guidance sufficient. These are important tools, but the decisive problem is the moral conduct of society. If the right to life and to a natural death are not respected, if human conception, pregnancy, and birth are achieved artificially, if embryos are sacrificed for research, and birth are achieved artificially, if embryos are, the concept of human ecology, and with it the concept of environmental ecology, will ultimately disappear from popular consciousness, unquote. It is a contradiction, Pope Benedict continued, to demand respect for the natural environment from new generations when education and laws do not help them respect themselves. The book of nature is one and indivisible, both with regard to the environment and to life, in the areas of sexuality, marriage, family, social relationships, in short, the integral development of the human being. Because humankind's duties towards the environment are intertwined with those duties that we have toward humanity in itself in relationship with others, one cannot demand some duties while repressing others. This, according to Pope Benedict, is a grave contradiction in contemporary mentality and practice, which humiliates humanity, disrupts the environment, and damages society. In Caritas in Veritate, he writes, the Church has a responsibility towards creation, and she must assert this responsibility in the public sphere. In so doing, she must defend not only the earth, water, and air as gifts of creation that belong to everyone. She must above all protect humankind from self-destruction. There is a need for what might be called a human ecology, correctly understood. The deterioration of nature is in fact intricately connected with the culture that shapes human coexistence. When human ecology is respected within society, environmental ecology also benefits. Just as human virtues are interrelated, such that the weakening of one places others at risk, so the ecological system is based on respect for a plan that affects both the health of society and its good relationship with nature. In order to protect nature, it is not enough to intervene with economic incentives or deterrence. Not even an opposite education is sufficient. These are important steps, but the decisive issue is the overall moral tenor of society. If there is a lack of respect for the right to life and to a natural death, if human conception, gestation, and birth are made artificial, it is contradictory to insist that future generations respect the natural environment when our educational system and laws do not. While still Cardinal Prefect of the Congregation for Doctrine and the Faith, he wrote, "The Christian option is exactly the opposite compared to the Gnostic one. Man is dependent, and only in the form of the lie of being can he deny this. He cannot help but live from others and live from trust. But dependence no longer has anything degrading about it when it takes the form of love. Because then it is no longer dependence, no longer a diminution of the self through the competition of the other, but then it constitutes precisely the self as self and liberates it, because love essentially takes the form of I want you to be. It is the creativum, the only creative power that can bring forth other without envy, without losing the self. Man is dependent. That is his primary truth. Because this is so, only love can redeem him. Because only love transforms dependence from freedom. He can therefore only destroy his own redemption, himself, if he eliminates love for safety's sake. For him, however, the crucified God is the visible certainty that creation is already an expression of love. We exist on the basis of such love. It is therefore a constitutive part of Christian faith to accept the mystery of the center of reality, to accept love, creation as love, and to live from there. At a conference for and with French bishops he had observed in the early 1980s, the marginalization of the doctrine of creation reduces the concept of God, including Christology. The religious is actually only located in the psychological and sociological realm. The material world is left to physics and technology, but only if existence itself, including matter, comes from God's hands and is in God's hands, can God really be our Savior and give us life, real life. There is a fatal tendency today to avoid and withdraw to the symbolic wherever matter comes into play. In the message of faith, from creation to the birth of Jesus from the Virgin and his resurrection, to the real presence of Christ and the transformation of bread and wine, and to our resurrection and the return of the Lord. It is not an indifferent theological dispute if the resurrection of the individual is transferred to death, and thus not only the soul is denied, but above all, the real physicality of salvation is disputed. A decisive renewal of faith in creation is thus also the prerequisite for the credibility and depth of Christology and eschatology." Unquote. Then he continues, "The belief in creation asks about the existence of being as such. Its problem is why something is at all and not nothing. The idea of development, on the other hand, asks why precisely these things are and not others, where they have acquired their infiniteness, and how they are related to the other formations. Philosophically, one would say that the idea of development is on the phenomenological level, dealing with individual entities that actually occur in the world, while the belief in creation is on the ontological level, asking behind the individual things, marveling at the miracle of being itself and trying to account for the mysterious is that we say about all occurring realities together. One could also formulate the belief in creation concerns the difference between nothing and something, whereas the idea of development concerns the difference between something and something else. Creation characterizes being as a whole, as being from a different whence, whereas development describes the inner structure of being and questions the specific whence of the individual existing realities. Unquote. Conclusion. Since the earliest beginnings of the rise of the environmental consciousness, popes have contributed to the discussions, reminding their audience repeatedly of the inseverable nexus between first, the creator, second, creation, third, environment, fourth, climate, and last but not least, fifth, the human being. One cannot do justice to any one of these components without bearing in mind the remaining four. It is singularly the ensouled creature, the human person, who can and must link ecology and anthropology, again, as he is in front of God responsible for this planet. Not being mindful of this foundational reality is the consequence of the fall. Ecology is first and foremost a moral issue that calls for the human being to discover that he is called to live responsoriality vis-a-vis God. In one of the last general audiences, during his singularly clairvoyant pontificate, Pope Benedict XVI said, quote, God is the origin of the beauty of creation. So it is that creation becomes a place in which to know and recognize the Lord's omnipotence and goodness. It is an appeal to our faith as believers that we proclaim God as creator. The book of Genesis tells us that God's first thought was to find a love that would correspond to his love. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Emery. I hope a few of you get to talk to him after it's over. He's a man of singular erudition and culture. Europeans always seem to have a breadth of experience and thought that brings something to the table. And thank you so much, Father. So for our last thing, we're going to have something like 15 or 20 minutes available for Q&A. We'll hang out here. And I decided to do a little book giveaway. And so I got the press to send us some books. Intended to send 5, so I got 4, so I just threw in one of my own. I got 30 of them when I published it, so I'll give you one. But yeah, guys, why don't you join me up here? And so this is just open. It could be on any of the topics, Dr. Muller and Newman, an analogy of creation, and I was talking about evolution and creation, and Father de Gaal. Just a minute. Am I good on the microphone? Do I need to turn the one off over here? Okay, hopefully that's good now. But anyway, the way the book giveaway works is that you get a book just by asking the first question. All right, so Sophia, you're probably saying, you ask the question. The question so people can hear it, especially on the stream. So, go ahead, Caleb.
Yeah, I appreciate all you guys putting out the talks. So recently I went to a talk with Deacon Carl and was talking along the same premises of ecology. And my main question with him was fairly cynical, but I want to see your guys' approach to it. The Catholic Church talks a lot about ecology and environmental change, but in a lot of ways it's very polar to the world's ideas.
think I do. I think Dr. Muller has a lot. You're the hut person. No, I'm the hut person. But no, I don't know. I've been seeing the slogan go around, "Make Catholicism weird again." Maybe that is part of it. Although I think being excellent at what you do, right? I like Saint Josemaria Escriva's spirituality of just, he did all things well, Jesus Christ did. So we should be doing the same thing in the world, for the world, but not of the world, as Monsignor Swetland, my professor, used to say. But yeah, they're going to think we're weird, probably. I mean, I know people think we're weird with having 7, 8 kids. So I think that's just part of the picture. Not everybody necessarily is called to have that many kids, but some people are infertile and all these sorts of things. But that's countercultural. It's not comfortable in many ways, but the joy is seen in the doing of it. And I think that applies also with whether it's living frugally, and some of you guys I know enjoy shopping at Sacred Heart Thrift Store. But shopping there instead of buying, my students say, instead of fast fashion and buying new things all the time. One of the things that we talk about at my home, and my wife is better than I am at, is buying locally, supporting local businesses, but also in the realistic awareness that the way society is, you're probably not going to be able to go live in the hut. And so I think that's the challenge of the day, really, is in the world, but not of the world, not worldly, but bringing the faith as that leaven to infuse the ordinary. I think, well, how do you do that? The answer we always got in grad school, which drove us nuts, is prudence. And prudence is messy, and prudence doesn't have only one answer, but you look at the models of people you see trying to do it. And of course, the Benedictines in their own right are a great example of this for the laity. I tell people, whether it's just having your own garden and realizing still 90% of what you buy is from the store, or people I know, students in class whose families are starting their own regenerative farms. But I think one thing that we bring to the table is a sobriety, that we're not going to cure everything right away, and we keep an eternal horizon, and yet that doesn't prevent us from changing the world today. So those are a couple thoughts I have. I don't know if you guys want to add to that. You want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I will. I mean, I know I said you had chickens. Yeah. Yeah, we don't have chickens at our house, but there's a great article or essay by a guy named William Kavanaugh. So if you've been in Christian Moral Life class with me, you've had to read Attachment and Detachment is the name of the essay. And he talks about various ways that we can practice these habits of an integral ecology, that we don't get pulled into the consumeristic vices of our culture that tend to, Pope Francis's phrase of a throwaway culture. And so, like, practicing those habits, Dr. Ramage talked about them, having a garden. Right? He talks about the change. Our homes used to be a place of production. Now they're a place of consumption. And can we turn our homes, can we find ways to produce more? Whether it's your own entertainment, your own food, your clothing, whatever it might be. Fix your own car, like don't go out and buy a new car, fix your car up. There's things like that, right, where you can practice these habits of production instead of consumption, I think are helpful ways to be countercultural, be different, but also not weird. Right? So that's how it ends.
If I may add, Mundelein Seminary has a solar panel farm, and from above it looks like a cross.
Whoa, that's great.
I think the microphone should be working now, so I can.
Oh, great. All right. Alicia?
I guess my question is a little farther away from the physical, but like as human beings, we have like an intellect, and that makes us different from, I guess, the animal world. And so I guess, how do we support the kind of like taking care of the ecology of like the human mind and the human intellect, and like evolution in like that sense, kind of like I guess what Dr. Muller you're talking about with poetry. Yeah, I don't know.
You want? Yeah.
So you talking the formation of our minds, or more like brain health? physiology of the brain. That one I'm no good at. Although I heard a podcast about it recently. Sounds
Well,
very
I guess like whatever you consider like intellect, like the part that separates us from like the sensible soul to like rational
Okay.
soul.
Yeah, so you guys might I'll say one thing, but I think the part about the poetic side of you could say that the poetry and the kind of poetic vision that I was talking about that Newman saw, he thought was a corrective to an overly like kind of mechanical view of human reason, and that we're really just computing machines, and the kind of romantic response to that was to say like no, and you had to read this already, sorry, in class, but Newman says like we're not a reasoning animal, we are a thinking, feeling, contemplating, acting animal, and that like to be rational does not simply mean you can solve logic puzzles, although that's a big part of it. Right? I can do crossword puzzles and stuff, and that's good, but that there's something more to human rationality than is just like that mechanical, and often the arts, poetry, reveals that to us, or is in a way of expressing that. So I think it's a deficiency I was a public school kid, and it's a deficiency in my education, is an appreciation for the arts and these other things that, as a parent now with kids, I'm like, kids, play music. Like, Dad, teach us. I can't, I don't know anything, but you guys need to, because it's really good for your brain and for your soul. And so trying to overcome that deficiency in my own formation, but I see that like, I think that's an important thing. But it's not functional often. It doesn't make a lot of money. It doesn't like design a new jet engine or something, but it's a still essential part of being human. So if you guys want
A little thought on that of getting out and reading the book of nature. St. Bernard and other saints have spoken of everything I learned in forests. Not to dismiss the value of what we're doing here with all your tuition dollars, but kind of, I guess, on that. But the idea that creation is God's other book is a traditional idea that we've kind of lost. And like Wendell Berry says, the environmentalist, we kind of reserve holiness for church buildings. And he's not a Catholic, but a Catholic could say something similar. While the sacraments are really the privileged means of grace, God's grace is granted to us in our whole life circumstance. So for me, it's always healing to just get outside in the field behind our house and just really meet God in different ways. You don't have to be a hippie and literally hug trees and stuff. So I think that's actually really critical part of our education, of being in touch with the real that he has created, and with the man-made arts too, right? Yeah, then over here, do we have a hand? Yes. You catch? There we go. Go ahead.
Yes. So, Dr. Ramage, you talked about like how we want to avoid scientism and fideism, like individually, and how we should like integrate science and faith. But I guess like which one takes priority in our lives? Because I know like you talk in our class a bunch about method C, exegesis and stuff, now looking at history through the lens of faith. So yeah, does that also apply to like just everyday life things, or is that specific to just the Bible?
What do you think, Father? Do you have a thing on that? Science or faith? It'd be fast. Do you want to?
So,
I'd love to hear a priest's perspective on this.
many things in this world of science have been invented or discovered by religious. The human intellect is a product of creation and thereby also of God, right? We can only contemplate God by verbalizing it, right? So one of the favorite poets of Pope Benedict was Hölderlin. Hölderlin was a mad poet living in a tower at a river in Tübingen, famous university town comparable to Harvard. And he coined the phrase, der Mensch ist zum Schauen berufen. Man is called to behold or to gaze, right? Lo sguardo, right? In Italian. So not only to see. This is what a robot can do. And I believe our culture suffers from a pandemic of grievances, and we do not know what these grievances really are. We make out surrogate grievances, but ultimately it is the lack of balance between faith and reason. It is the lack of balance between the right and the left parts of our brain. Yeah? And this must be brought into balance again. And the omnipresent presence of technology deprives us of this, right?
I have a slight interjection, but like,
Go for it.
so kind of essentially what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong in understanding this, but like that science and faith are not truths, like two separate truths that are both essentially the same truth, so that like we can like they're not essentially different. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So science reflects on the makeup, construction of nature, of the physical world, more or less, right? But that is not the result of chance,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, the content of faith and the act of faith are in correlation to one another. Fides qua and fides que. And there, in the fides que, also science comes into play, right?
Yeah.
So they're both constitutive. I must make my act of faith, but this is correlated and accompanied by a rational penetration of both the content of faith and of the physical realm around me.
Something makes me think on that, and it goes back to Dr. Muller's paper on Newman, of how, so in biblical interpretation, Harper was referring to the spiritual comes through the literal for people like Aquinas and Ratzinger. And so in the book of creation, to build on those thoughts, the spiritual comes through the literal. You have this biological structure like the butterfly. And Teresa of Avila says, well, guess what? The butterfly is an image for the resurrection. How is that? Well, it liquefies itself and then metamorphizes and all of a sudden can fly. And this thing in nature that just seems like a brute fact not only is beautiful in itself, but it has spiritual meaning. So in the history of the church, Bible and fathers, it's fascinating how they're always looking for the spiritual meaning that's inherent in the literal of the science and stuff. Over here? Oh, go ahead.
Right, one little tip at that, and that's why I think Newman talks about in his idea of university, which Dr. Ramage mentioned, and I did not. I talked briefly for a second about it. He talks about the circle of knowledge, and that every discipline has its kind of distinct subject matter and ways of studying that subject matter, but ultimately it all unifies because all truth is one. But he warns of religious people, especially Catholics, of having the tendency to like overstep. Like theology wants to do physics, and physics wants to do theology, and this is why every discipline has to be included in the university. Because if you take one out, the other ones will try to do their job, and so he warns, both physicists, like he defends the role of theology in a university, so that physicists or whoever, right, don't start trying to make gods out of their subject matter. But also he gives the warning to theology not to put clamps on or limit the fields of science, partly for this reason, I think, because once you discover how the process of going from caterpillar to butterfly happens, then there's something theology can then, like natural theology can think about, or analogies that can be drawn. But if you were to limit what science is allowed to study, or put limits on the study of certain areas because those questions are difficult in the moment, you're putting limits on what the church could know and the spiritual depth of like knowledge of the natural world going forward if we don't give that patience and humility. So
That's really good. That is super helpful. Brother Jean-Marie over here. Oh, you have the, good.
So I realize for Father de Gaal, this may not be an entirely hypothetical question, but I'll ask it nonetheless. If you could have lunch with these two great and holy men, Benedict and Newman, what questions would you ask them, and why?
You mean Newman and Ratzinger? So, well, one question would be, what did you experience as a 15-year-old in 1816 that changed your perspective and was the recurring melody throughout your life? Yeah? He does not speak about what actually did occur then. That would be a question I would ask him. Ratzinger, perhaps it would be a similar question, but with Ratzinger we do not know when he had a particular religious experience. Maybe it was a catenation of such experiences throughout his life, but there is something in his persona that immediately made one be on the same wavelength as he. And this is a gift very few human beings have, and I have encountered it with him, and I believe this must also have a spiritual explanation, right? So we can only say the experience of the ground of all being or something like that.
This is not as profound, but I want to recount a quick story that Father de Gaal told me a while back when Benedict was still alive. So I knew he was in contact with him, and I asked him, did he ever say he's writing anything else? And you told me he just looked at you and smiled. So I wondered, well, he retired. He's not writing anymore. So he was writing, and actually, FYI, there's a book. I don't know if this is what he was talking about. What is Christianity? Is a compilation of his essays that got published after he died. He kept writing, even though he wasn't writing as Pope, right? But he didn't think he'd even get a chance to do that, but he kept writing. So not only was this a good theoretical question, but this is a guy who actually asked Ratzinger questions. So it's pretty wild. Another book. We're not limited to one more question necessarily, but one more book to go around. Anybody want the book? Oh, yes.
So in a bit of a different direction. So generally with evolution, you think of groups of organisms evolving. How could that fit together with then the soul being given to our original two parents, Adam and Eve, with original sin, et cetera?
Have you thought about this one? Okay, I actually have thought a lot about this one. I have about 80 pages on this topic, but it's a great question about the soul and the first two parents. Okay, so first of all, I like to say there are actually multiple options you can take. I really like to lean heavily on St. Augustine's saying, in essentials unity, in doubtful matters liberty, in all things charity. And I like to use Aquinas' quote from the commentary in the fourth book of Sentences, where he says, in matters of science and faith, these questions, in many cases, even the saints disagree. Okay, now with that by way of background, so I was on a panel, it was a conference on Thomism and science, and what I consider to be the world expert on Catholicism and evolution is a guy named Ken Kemp. And he's coming out with a book that's about yay thick on the real history of Catholicism and evolution. And he goes through the different ideas people have had, but we definitely have to believe as Catholics the soul is directly created by God. But like Ratzinger says, it doesn't mean God intervenes in the biology. The marvel is he does it through the biology. So for us, like who are in the broadly Thomist group, we're trying to figure out, okay, when might that event have occurred? Because we have this, as good as you can get in fossils, steady stream of increasing brain case size, height. We're making fire hundreds of thousands of years ago, then we're making art 200,000 years ago, and then we don't see the really amazing cave paintings until something like 50,000 years ago. So like one option is that Genesis as described, there's one infusion of the soul, and that occurs, this is what our debate was about last summer. Ken Kemp says Adam was Homo heidelbergensis, so a Heidelberger Adam, and he puts Adam at 750,000 years ago. And then within that, you have a sub-debate. Did the same final set of mutations, the biology making way for the soul to be integrated with it, which Thomism calls the infusion of the soul, did that happen in Eve, one woman at the exact same time in God's providence? Maybe. Be a long shot, but God does stuff. But the other option is it happened once, and then it gradually spread through the genetic lineage. But whatever the case may be, we tend to be agreed on hylomorphism, that the soul and body are utterly one. So whenever the infusion of the soul happens, there must have been a biological change that accompanied it. And it may have looked small from the outside, but we know, and this again is not my area, this is the scientists, but we know that small mutations, immediate, can make huge differences. So people like Father Nicanor Austriaco, the Dominican biologist, point to things like language genes. Maybe there's a last zipper that kind of clicks in place, and the predecessors were almost there, and then all of a sudden, boom, there really is a night and day difference. And on the other hand, it'd be more difficult to square theologically and require a whole book on its own about a more gradual evolution. But I like to compare one analogy, and this is something I've been kind of toying around with, and it's good to go to conferences for. So we know that in a human, they're human from the day of conception. But like my wife and I were discussing last night, at what point do they become, like, when can they start sleeping? Right? In the womb, they start sleeping. But Jen said, well, that predicates the question of, well, when are they awake? When are you first awake? And, we're looking at different data, I don't know, 28 weeks, 26 weeks. But, then in communion, in the Roman Rite, at least in this country I'm familiar with, we usually give communion around age 7, the age of reason. But I'm also pretty sure we've had kids that were rational in volitionally rejecting our commands at an earlier date than that. And so they've been rational in their soul the whole time. They just took time, in Thomist terms, to actualize their potencies. So that's a long way of saying that you could have a first Adam that was a one atom, and it just took generation upon generation to actualize it. But there are other options out there. So good work is being done on this, and I want to recommend a guy. It's Father Marius with a Z, Tabacek, T-A-B-A-C-Z-E-K. But he has all kinds of articles out there really trying to understand how the infusion of the soul works while respecting nature. And we've never been at a better time in many ways. I would have been long dead of many causes in my life if I weren't alive today. But that we have people in the church from multiple angles working on these topics. I hope that gets some directionality. Again, I'll stop myself there because I would talk for another hour.
Thank you.
Let's see one in the very back. Yeah.
We already have a book, so you don't have to send another one our way because we have all things in common. This is kind of related to Sister's question, so I'll see if I can tie it in. But I guess my question is, what do we mean by the infusion of soul respecting nature? So I'm thinking of the hierarchy of being, and then also a bunch of articles we read in Christ and the Trinity, like Ronner and Taylor Desjardins and Sheen on the idea of this, the movement from greater penetration of spirit and matter. You have matter, and then you have animal life, and plant life, animal life, and then rational life. Each of these representing a seismic leap ontologically. So this question being the question of language, and I think, it's been a while since I've looked into this, but I think it's something like 150,000 years ago, there's a sort of a semiotic explosion. Suddenly, there's humanoid creatures who are using symbols, and which can't be explained by factors of the environment and even factors of consciousness. There's just a difference in quality between making signals of where the food is and saying this is food and this is a sunset, and making symbolic declaration. So I don't know if my question is do you, to me, that's even without revelation, you can't explain those moments except that there's got to be a greater factor at work. So when we say respecting the natural process, I think those moments give evidence that there's something greater than self-enclosed system of nature. And maybe this relates to the question of whether what Newman's describing gets too close to deism or not. And I think to the question that Father brought up of, and Dr. Muller, about like seeing holes and a poetic way of seeing actually being a particularly human characteristics, to be able to see the gestalt, right? We're the only animal that does this, and you can't explain that by a physical cause or a material cause. So, what do you think of that?
Yeah, actually, Ratzinger has a neat point where he says you can't excavate the soul with a shovel. He actually locates, if you had to say one thing that makes us human and rational, he says it's the capacity for relationship with God. And so that holism. Now, also though, from a classic Thomistic point of view, you know the soul by its activities. So like you said, like if you look on the Smithsonian's website or go to Chris Baglow's books, who's speaking here this Friday, a great faith and science book for high school classrooms he wrote. He has beautiful images in there. Like the Smithsonian will point out, well, Neanderthals were making eagle talon necklaces by 150,000 years ago, right? So we can kind of point like the earliest date, they had to have been rational at this point because, heck, I can't even make that, look at my drawings, they think I lived 3 million years ago, and those sorts of things. So, but we know they're at least rational by that point of view. The phrase with respecting nature or correlating with nature is just a classical Thomistic way of saying you don't want to violate the natural order because God made it. So you're not going to have a human rational soul infused into a banana, right? It's just a stupid example. So the matter has to be fit for the soul, because at bottom, Ratzinger's big shtick is they aren't two separate standalone substances. They're an inner unity. And that's what Aquinas means with the soul as the form of the body. By saying it's immaterial, we're not saying it's a ghost that enters us. We're saying it's not material. So here's a challenge, I think, about all things like this. You have to use material imagery. You have to have phantasms, Aquinas would say, images, even as you know the soul is not material. And that's why I think one of the reasons theology is called the highest science. With God, too, you have to use images, and you immediately, I think, either fall into tritheism or modalism. But you have to use the imagery somehow. And yes, St. Patrick, people like to call him a heretic because of the clover, but you have to use it. Anyway, just a few thoughts on that, how you've got the language you have to deploy, even though you realize the language is limited. Sorry, where am I? Yeah. Yeah, so like why couldn't he have had the whole population and then infused it into one or two? Well, here's the thing. Do you have like a whole population of like they're hanging out, like doing their like Homo erectus thing and not pondering higher things? Or are they doing it, you mean? Are they pondering higher things and then they get the soul? Okay. That's kind of exactly what is being envisioned, actually, is you have a population. The genetics, as you probably know, points to a population that's at least something like 10,000 breeding individuals. And then it's out of that population, the standard line is thought that God raises them, if you will. Is that kind of what you were going with? Yeah, that's actually what I was trying to say. I might not have said it, though.
That's from a letter. Letters and Diaries, number 24. So Newman kept everything. Let me see here. Where was that from? Accent says. IBID doesn't tell me anything. Yes, a letter to J. Walker Scarborough. You guys know who that is? Me either. May 22nd, 1868. Letters and Diaries, chapter 24, or volume 24, page 77. So, yeah, but Newman kept almost everything he ever wrote. He'd like double write the letters so he could send one and keep one, and then he kept a box. He had a box of things he would continually go through every year, like his stuff, and kind of recatalog it. And he even had a box of things that said these things aren't worth keeping, and then he put it back on the shelf and kept it. So there's 33 volumes of his letters, and that's not everything. So there's a lot to go through, and you can find these little gem quotes in letters to random people and stuff like that. So it's a fun area to get into if you want to join the Newman nerds, right? The Newmaniacs, as we call it, right?
I think officially, I think I see it's 9:20 something. I better wrap this up for us, guys. If you have further questions, please, I'm happy to drink some coffee and talk. I'd like you to meet Father de Gaal. Thank you all very much for coming. Appreciate it.